I was 12 years old when I first heard the word resilient from my mother. She used it in a casual way, as adults occasionally do, and I liked the way it sounded. She told me one afternoon in the shop, her voice a whisper over the smell of dirt and freshly cut flowers. My father had only been dead for a year, and I wasn't sure what resilience was supposed to look like, but as I watched her transform that small shop into something beautiful and stable, I saw it in her. As a young girl, I was barely old enough to comprehend how hard she worked to keep everything stable, but I was old enough to sense it. There were late nights when I finished my homework at the counter, watching her hands carefully move through bundles of lies or bundles of roses, and I used to think her hands knew that we were resilient even though a shadow of grief never quite left her face. Mom's flower shop became our anchor when things got tough, becoming a cocoon of warmth and earth and living things. As I got older, I concentrated on my studies and discovered my own passions, which ended up being literature in college. I enrolled in an advanced literature course taught by a professor named Robert, who was known for his intensity and insight. I had heard people say that he was brilliant and had a way of making books come to life with his lectures, and I'll admit that during the first few classes, I understood why students talked about him the way they did. At first, he was just another professor, but something about the way he looked at me felt too aware, almost as if he saw things I hadn't said or shown. Sometimes his gaze lingered for too long, or he'd make a comment about my insights that felt uncomfortably personal, but as quickly as it appeared, the feeling would vanish. He was also knowledgeable, and his charm could be disarming. His lectures had a way of drawing everyone in and holding our attention as if we were all part of some grand narrative he had created himself. He was respected in his field, so there was no reason to feel uncomfortable about it. Our interactions were never more than a few words here and there, and the look in his eyes unnerved me, but I dismissed it as nerves and the awkwardness of being noticed in a sea of students. It wasn't long before those looks weren't limited to class though, because one day as I was leaving the library late, I turned a corner and almost ran into him. I was left feeling a knot in my stomach, unsure of what to make of it. I remember lying awake that night, replaying the conversation in my mind, wondering why words seemed to burrow into me, why I couldn't shake the unease. He smiled with me, almost as if he had been waiting there, and casually mentioned that he had noticed my dedication to studying, and that it was rare to see such focus in someone so young. His words felt slightly off, like an actor reading lines that didn't quite fit. I told myself that I was overanalyzing, but something about it gnawed. When I walked into the living room on a weekend visit home and saw him sitting on our couch drinking tea with my mother, my heart skipped a beat. I stood frozen, unable to believe that he was here in our home laughing at something my mother had said. He stopped paying me any particular attention almost as soon as he had started, and he hardly looked my way during class, speaking to me only in passing. I was able to breathe easier because I had managed to put it all in my head. As I watched them together, Robert took my hand in a courteous professional handshake, his smile warm and familiar as if we were all part of the same play, the same scene rehearsed and easy, and I could hardly breathe as they told me how they'd met at a community book event a few months ago. Mom gushed about how he understood her, how they had so much in common, and how he'd helped her. Her face was glowing in a way I hadn't seen in years, and she introduced him with a laugh, calling him her special someone. She looked so happy, her eyes sparkling, her voice light with laughter. I wanted to scream that this man was not who she thought he was, but instead I nodded and smiled as I watched her happiness fill the room. Over the next few weeks, Robert's presence in our home grew, his belongings slowly mingling with ours. A coat here, a book there, and he knew how to blend in so easily that my mother took it as a sign, calling it fate with a dreamy. I tried to get rid of the uneasiness that pervaded her whenever he was around. Maybe I was judging him unfairly, or maybe he was everything. Mom was happier than she had been in years, so that had to mean something. A few months later, they got married in a small private ceremony that was simple but meant the world to her. She looked stunning in her ivory dress, her face glowing with joy, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't bring myself to voice my worries. Only ruin this for her and us both, so I played along, pretending that the nervousness I felt around him was just a relic of my own fears. After the wedding, Robert moved into our house and blended in perfectly. He started helping Mom at the flower shop, finding ways to win over her C customers with his plant knowledge. At times, I watched him with them, wondering if they noticed my almost too polished charisma. He seemed to notice that I always managed to be close when I least expected it. A passing touch, a quick smile, a comment that only I could hear, and that he enjoyed pushing the boundaries to see how far he could go without breaking the surface. Despite my best efforts to ignore the feeling, it grew stronger every time he entered the room. Generally, I kept my distance when I was at home, filling my days with errands or finding excuses to visit friends. The house seemed to change after Robert moved in, almost imperceptibly, like shadows stretching further as the day turned into night. Little by little, his presence seeped into every corner, filling spaces I didn't even know could feel different, even though I'd learned to avoid him as much as possible. It was becoming harder though, because he was always around, an almost inescapable part of my days. I pushed it all aside whenever I saw my mother's happiness, convinced that I was overreacting and that it was all in my head. She was completely enamored with Robert, and at first I wanted to be happy for her. She was always talking about how kind he was, how he understood her interest in the shop, how he was good with her customers, and how he charmed them into staying to listen to his stories. He would make it a point to walk Mom and me home after work in the evenings, and I would follow him a few steps behind. She was humming while watering the flower beds outside when her laugh rang louder and lighter. When things seemed a little too strange, I felt like an outsider observing a child who was acting unaware. At one point, while I was folding laundry in my room, Robert knocked and opened the door without waiting for a response. He said, "I'm making dinner tonight," his voice dripping with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. His eyes were soft, but beneath that look that had haunted me from his lectures and occasionally, I run into Robert at college. I managed to nod while keeping my eyes on the folded clothes in my hands. I said, "Thanks, Robert," hoping he would get the hint and walk away, but he didn't move and instead stood there observing me for a long time. "You don't have to be so formal, you can call me Dad," he said softly, his words lingering in the air like a cloud. I stiffened, barely able to keep the tension from showing on my face when he spoke. I flinched before I could stop myself, but he didn't seem to notice. "I understand," he whispered. "It's a lot of change for you." His tone was gentle, but it felt wrong, like a lullaby sung out of tune. I forced a smile and nodded, waiting until he finally left, before I let out the tension, leaving my body in one long breath. Dinner that night was quiet, and my mother chatted away, unaware of the tension between us. For her, he was the ideal husband, caring and considerate, going above and beyond to make us feel like a whole family, as she liked to say. But to me, every act of kindness felt like something else entirely, as if he was waiting for something I couldn't quite understand. After that night, I began working longer shifts at the campus library, finding excuses to stay out late. I told Mom I was working on assignments that were difficult for me to focus on at home, and she seemed to understand, but I could see Mom noticed, of course, that one night as I was brushing my teeth, she came into the bathroom with a soft but worried expression. She said, "You've been so distant lately." She put a hand on my shoulder and asked if everything was okay. She was disappointed that I wasn't adjusting as quickly as she hoped. I wanted to be around her to feel the way I had before, but every time I saw Robert's coat by the door or heard his voice down the hall, the knot in my stomach tightened and the urge to leave grew stronger. The words hurt because I could feel the truth of them, but they didn't make the feelings go away. Robert's gaze seemed to cling to me whenever we were alone, and his compliments seemed to get more pointed, as if he was testing how close he could get before I pulled away. I took a deep breath and then forced a smile, thinking, "I think it's just school stress, Mom. I'll be fine." Her eyes softened, and she nodded, hugging me tightly. When I helped out at the flower shop, he would offer to walk me home, his hand a little too firm on my shoulder, his gaze a little too fixed on me. When we said goodnight, my instincts told me to be cautious, to keep my distance, but I was never sure if what he was saying was genuine. It was always subtle. He would begin by telling me how proud he was of my accomplishments and how he saw special brilliance in me. I was overreacting one Saturday night when I arrived home early from a school function in the hopes of having a quiet evening. I saw Robert in the kitchen with a glass of wine, and he smiled when he saw me. His eyes were sweeping over me in an intrusive manner, and he gestured to the empty house, saying, Your mother's at a friend's tonight. I forced a polite smile and nodded as I sat down on the other side of the counter, my body tense and ready to leave at the first sign. I'm just going to grab some food and go to bed. He chuckled, a low, quiet sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I thought back to my college days when he said, "I see a lot of myself in you." His voice was soft and almost conspiratorial, and he added, "I take a sip of my wine." The comment felt too personal and purposeful, and I could feel my skin prickling under his gaze. I muttered something about having some homework to finish and hurried out of the room, closing my bedroom as soon as possible. I felt a wave of relief after locking the door behind me. This continued for months, with small, seemingly innocuous gestures carrying a weight I couldn't identify. His compliments became bolder, and his eyes lingered a bit too long. I started to avoid being home whenever possible, spending my days with friends, the library, and other places that kept me away, but my absence wasn't unnoticed. My mother would leave little notes in my room reminding me that she missed me and that she wanted us to spend more time together. I could see the sadness in her eyes every time I left the house, and it caused me to feel more and more guilty every day. On one of the few occasions when I stayed at home, I found her waiting for me in the kitchen. Her face was a mix of hurt and confusion, and she asked, "Are you avoiding us?" in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Is it Robert?" Hit me like a shock of electricity, and I was at a loss for words, wondering how I could explain it without coming across as paranoid. "No, Mom, it's not like that," I lied, forcing a comforting smile. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't her, the house, or even Robert. It was the way everything felt like a stage, the way he seemed to shift roles when she wasn't around, slipping in and out of different versions of himself with such ease. However, I couldn't bear to break her happiness, so I nodded, promising to spend more time. "Just school has been a lot," she said, her worry softening but not disappearing. "I just want us to be a family," she whispered. When winter crept in quietly that year, bringing with it a bitter chill that seemed to seep into my bones, I caught a cold dreary December weekend, something fierce that left me feverish and exhausted, spending most of my days sleeping off the cold. But as the days went by, Robert's gaze grew more intent and his presence more invasive. At home, I stayed despite the fact that the thought filled me with dread, hoping that eventually my feelings would settle and that things would start to feel normal. Illness. I'd been home all week, hardly leaving my room as I tried to recover. Robert and I were the only ones in the house because my mom was out a lot, busy with the holiday rush at the shop. This reality made every quiet hour feel like a slow, suffocating weight. I wanted to get rid of the fever so I could have the strength to walk out and leave, but my body had betrayed me. I was too weak to keep up with the charade, my mind was clouded by the fever, my limbs were heavy and sore, and I lay in bed for hours listening to. Robert knocked on my door one evening as the sun was setting. His voice was soft, almost gentle. "I made you some tea," he said, stepping in before I could respond. The sight of him standing there with a steaming cup made my stomach turn, but I forced a polite smile in the hopes that he would leave quickly. "Thank you," I murmured, sitting up with difficulty. The effort made my head swim, and I closed my eyes for a moment trying to steady myself. I nodded, hoping the gesture would be enough to get him to leave slowly. He turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Only when I heard the soft click of the front door closing did I exhale, letting the tension leave my body. "Precision, you need to take care of yourself," he said in a worried tone. "Drink this, get some rest, you'll feel better soon." His gaze lingered on me, his eyes tracing the line of my cheek and the curve of my neck. I didn't want to touch the steam curling up toward me with the scent of chamomile, but my throat was dry and I was too exhausted to resist. I took a few tiny sips, and the warmth soothed my raw throat. Almost immediately, a heavy, unnatural wave of drowsiness overcame me, making my limbs feel like lead. I tried to shake it off, but my body wouldn't respond, and a panic flashed in the back of my mind, but it was muffled by the fog that was closing in. I could feel my consciousness slipping my body. I felt helpless and vulnerable as I sank into the bed, unable to resist the weight pulling me under. Somewhere in the haze, I heard footsteps and a shadow approaching me. My mind cried out for me to get up and move so I could do something, but my body was motionless and paralyzed by numbness. The shadow leaned over me, and I felt a hand brush against my forehead, soft and almost tender. I tried to open my eyes to speak, but my voice was locked somewhere deep inside my words, swallowed by the fog. I felt his hand slide down, a touch that made my skin crawl and filled me with a terror I couldn't voice. I was trapped in my own body, forced to endure as the man who had warmed his way into our lives and deceived my mother with his charm and warmth now revealed the true depths of his betrayal. Time lost all meaning as I realized that this wasn't concern or kindness, but rather something dark and sinister that had been lurking just beneath the surface all along. When I finally regained consciousness, the first thing I felt was the ache in my body, a deep throbbing pain that pulsed with every breath. The weight of what had happened settled over me like a crushing force suffocating in its finality, and I pulled the blanket around me, curling into myself as the horror of the situation unfolded. I lay there helpless, forced to witness a horror that I had no strength to resist. The world blurred around me, the darkness creeping closer and pulling me under until there was nothing left but a hollow, endless silence. I wanted to scream and cry to let the flood of anger, pain, and betrayal pour out of me, but I felt hollow as if the life had been drained from me, leaving only a fragile shell behind. The betrayal I'd felt before was nothing compared to this. Nothing compared to the shattering realization that the man I'd feared, the man who had taken so much from us, was capable of such cruelty such as this. The night before replayed in my mind, each memory sharper than the last, and the silence in the house was deafeningly broken only by the ticking of the clock on my wall. I lay there for what seemed like hours, numb and empty, my mind caught in a tornado of despair and incredulity, until the need for air to escape pushed me out of bed. I staggered to the bathroom, my legs barely supporting me, and stared at my reflection with numb horror. The girl staring back at me looked broken, a shadow of the person I'd been before. I scrubbed my skin raw, trying to get rid of the memory of his touch, but nothing would come clean no matter how hard I tried. The darkness clung to me like a stain that would not go away. I knew that I couldn't stay here and allow him to continue to use his charm and lies to trick my mother. I had to tell her what he really was and what he had done, but as I stood there shaking, I felt the weight of silence pressing down on me. I was afraid that if I told her the truth, it would destroy her world and the happiness she had worked so hard to create because she loved him, trusted him, and I took a deep breath to protect myself from the pain, fear, and doubt that threatened to consume me. I had to tell her for her sake and for my own sake because I couldn't let the darkness win. I hadn't planned to tell her that night. In fact, I hadn't planned anything at all, but I couldn't keep quiet because I couldn't stay silent and let him get away with this or continue to twist his way through our lives unchecked. The secret had reached a breaking point, and when I saw her sitting on the couch in the soft glow of the lamp, the words just came out. She looked so calm, her hands holding a warm cup of tea, her eyes soft and warm, and I knew I couldn't hold it in any longer. She looked up at me with a smile, and I knew I couldn't hold it in any longer, Mom. There's something I need to tell you. I started, my voice barely a whisper, and she looked up, her face in curiosity, but as soon as she saw my expression, her smile vanished. The tone abruptly changed to one of concern as the motherly instinct kicked in. She set aside her tea, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and I struggled to find the right words. My throat felt like sandpaper, and my heart was thumping in my chest. I felt as though I was standing on a precipice, with the truth threatening to push me over the edge. I opened my mouth, but my voice caught in my throat, and for a moment I thought I wouldn't have the strength to speak. But then the memory of that night, with his hands on me and my own body locked in betrayal, came flooding back. Before I could stop them, the words flew out. They were about Robert. He hurt me, Mom. He did something terrible. She stared at me, her eyes widening as the weight of what I had said set in. I could see the horror and disbelief flashing across her face, each emotion sharper than the last. What do you mean? She asked, her voice shaking. How did he hurt you? Her voice trembled as I described everything, starting with small, unsettling gestures and ending with the tea he'd given. I watched her face go pale with every word, her hands gripping the couch's edge as if she needed something to hold on to, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to process the nightmare I'd laid at her feet. No, she whispered, her voice strangled. No, this can't be. I didn't know, I didn't see. I was sick. and the haze left me helpless. And then finally the violation broke any pieces of safety I'd once felt. She choked out her voice, which was full of guilt, but I trusted him and believed that he loved us. I thought, "Oh my God, Mom, it's not your fault," and I whispered, reaching out to place my hand over hers. The touch grounded us both in a moment that was too painful for Bear to know. He kept it and who he was from all of us. She shook her head, her shoulders shaking as the first sob came out of her mouth. "But I should have seen it. I should have protected you." She was crying now. When she cried, her sobs filled the quiet room with the sound of my own shallow breathing, and we remained like that for a long time, clinging to each other in the darkness as we were both bound by the pain of betrayal. Her whole body trembled as she tried to contain the overwhelming flood of guilt and pain. It was as if the truth had broken something deep inside her, a trust that could never be restored, a wound that would scar over but never truly heal. I nodded, the fear that had once paralyzed me replaced by a strange hollow sense of relief that I had broken the silence. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. She pulled back, wiping her face with trembling hands, and her eyes were red and swollen, but there was a fierce resolve in her gaze that hadn't been there before we went to the police. Her voice was steady as she said, "He will pay for what he's done." Mom's hand was locked around mine, her grip so tight it was almost painful. She hadn't said a word since we'd left the house, her face pale and set with a grim look. It was even colder than I had imagined, with dim fluorescent lights casting a sickly glow over everything. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, mingling with the sharp scent of stale coffee and worn-out upholstery. It was strange to think that this place. The officer at the front desk looked up as we got closer, his gaze moving from my mother to me, his expression softening with a sort of professional sympathy. He nodded toward the row of plastic chairs lined up against the wall, saying, "Please take a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." The chairs were uncomfortable, hard plastic that dug into my back, but I could feel the tension radiating from her, a quiet rage simmering just beneath the surface held back by a thread that threatened to snap with every second that passed. After what seemed like hours, a woman in a navy blazer approached us. Her eyes kind but steady, Mrs. Davis asked, looking at me with a gentle nod. "I'm Detective Carter. Why don't we step into my office?" Her footsteps echoed against the tile. I glanced at Mom, her face unreadable, her gaze fixed on the floor as if she were trying to gather the strength for what lay ahead. I barely noticed that my mind was a haze of emotions, fear, anger, and shame, all of which blended into a dull ache that pulsed with every beat of my heart. Detective Carter opened a door and motioned for us to enter the room, which was small and sparsely furnished with just a table, a few chairs, and a large window that looked out into the hallway. A video camera was mounted in the corner, a silent witness to everything that would be said within these doors. As we passed closed doors, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching myself from a distance, floating somewhere above the cold, unfamiliar surroundings. Walls. I sat down with my hands folded tightly in my lap, my body tense with the weight of what I was about to reveal. Detective Carter said in a soft, reassuring voice, "Take your time." I looked at my mother, who was still pale, her eyes focused on the detective with a kind of desperate determination. She nodded slightly, her hand resting on my shoulder, and her silent encouragement gave me the strength to start. I started slowly, my voice shaky, the words catching in my throat as I described the months of subtle manipulation, the gestures that had seemed innocuous at first, but as I described every detail and boundary he had tested and broken, I could feel the detective's gaze hardening on me. As I spoke, my voice became stronger, and the fear gave way to a simmering anger and a need to regain the power that had been taken from me. I told her about the tea, and the drowsiness that had left me paralyzed, and the horror that followed each word felt like a weight being lifted from my chest, but the pain of releasing it made my hands shake and my heart race. Mom listened in silence, her face a mask of horror and guilt, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles were white. I could see the pain in her eyes, the agony of realizing what she'd missed, the guilt that would linger long. Detective Carter's face remained calm, but I could see the anger in her eyes, a quiet fury tempered by professionalism. She asked a few questions, her tone gentle, and I answered as best I could, each response removing another layer of the nightmare that had plagued me. When I finished the room, Detective Carter fell silent, closed her notepad, and nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me all of this," she said, her voice low and steady. "I know it wasn't easy," she said, turning to Mom. "I'm so sorry," she said, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. "But you've done the right thing," she said, her face crumpling as she buried it in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sob. I reached out and placed a hand on her arm. We left the station in silence, the cold night air biting against our skin as we walked to the car. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Detective Carter left to make the necessary arrangements, and after that, Mom and I sat there in silence, the weight of what had happened pressing down on us. I looked at her and the pain etched in her face, and I knew that even though the journey ahead would be difficult, we would face it together. Although the road ahead would be long, I knew we would face it together, reclaiming our lives one step at a time. Robert's arrest occurred shortly after our visit to the police station, and while I was relieved, I also felt the hollow ache of something else as we pulled into the driveway. Thoughts of that room of the truth I had finally spoken lingered like a scar that would never go away. I could see the guilt weighing on Mom as she closed the flower shop indefinitely, unable to face the place she had once loved, and our home, which had once been so warm, was now tainted by the memory of betrayal. One evening, Mom finally looked at me and said, "I need some time away to find myself again." I nodded, understanding more than I could articulate, and she left for a quiet retreat, leaving me behind using. When Mom returned, she had a quiet resilience in her eyes that had been missing. She hugged me, and I could feel our shared strength as a thread connecting us as we faced our grief together. I found comfort in routines, organizing, listening to music, and writing. I wrote down everything I wanted to let go of, including my fears, anger, and memories. However, facing it head-on was painful, but the act of breaking my silence piece by piece became a way of healing and unburdening. Mom reopened the flower shop, and I spent hours there finding comfort and creating beauty again. The journey wasn't easy, but with every day we reclaimed a bit more of ourselves, learning that resilience could grow in even the darkest of places. I vowed never to let silence rule my life again, finding peace, speaking my truth, and living openly. The pain was shared, along with guilt, anger, and sadness, and together we were in therapy working through what he'd left behind. Together, we carried the past with us while welcoming a future filled with hope, strength, and the unbreakable link that had kept us alive.